For this particular PMConnect session, it was a tough call deciding whether or not we were going to still talk more about Agile, because we've had a number of sessions that have covered Agile, but we think we have a pretty good case to bring forward to you and let you know what's going on in the Commonwealth.
So then how do you start? This is a big project. I don't know where to start, what to do in my first sprint. It's okay. Think about what Agile, just break it down. Any type of software project, any type of project, you can break it down into big modules. So just start there. Maybe that's your first sprint. Here's this big application that runs through millions of dollars. You know, it has to administer millions of dollars. Where do I start? The other thing about Scrum is you're going to find that a lot of these things can be applied to almost any type of industry. You can break down things and you'll start seeing the workflow. All right. Once you have the modules, you can really then say, all right, what are we going to be developing? What are the slim requirements we're going to be doing in each sprint? We had a really large end user base for this project, the large one I'm talking about. So what did we do? It's a really large audience. Well, first, I started with educating my team, my IT team, because that's what I have the most control over. Educated them on Scrum, energized them, empowered them. It's very empowering to use Scrum, because the project's not about TAN, even though I'm here talking about it. So my team is back in the home office rooting me on, but it empowers them, because I'm not the Scrum Master, someone else is. Okay, that's really powerful. So in terms of this large project, we immediately started talking to our end user base. Once we were trained, we went out, we let them know that this is what we're doing. It's incremental, it's iterative, it's agile, and that was outrageously powerful. They felt like they were part of the process from the beginning versus everybody wait a couple years or 5 years and here you go, now roll on to this. They were part of the process from the beginning, really, really huge part of our success. In terms of our startup lessons, again, I would start with your IT team. Make sure they're well versed in it so they can help disseminate that information. Really, you just need to know a few key things. What is a sprint? What do you mean by backlog? Who's your product owner? And what are some of the key ceremonies, like the stand-up meeting, that you have to do? You have to educate the business sponsors on Agile also. Otherwise, they will revert back. Even though they'll see all this great work you're doing, they're going to revert back and say, no, wait, where are the requirements? Where's that requirements document? Did we talk about this? Where are the meeting minutes? So I'm going to talk to you about that, because I'm having a challenge right now. You know, so the project, this large project I'm working on, is 10 years in the making. My team has only worked on it maybe 18 months or less. We deployed 2 weeks ago, huge accomplishment. And I'm having a little bit of a change management challenge right now with my business sponsors, where ring, ring, hello, square one. Wait, why do you keep calling me? Because they keep going back to square one and they're asking me all these questions. So we're re-educating them, making them comfortable. We're going to go through another round of demos with them so that they can feel comfortable with what we're rolling people onto. Lessons learned. This is another major question people ask me about vendor management. All of our projects are different. When you have a large project, more than likely you're going to be working with more than one vendor, correct? So it's really important, and I know this is going to be one of the questions that comes up at the panel, make sure you're working with legal so that you can add some language on Agile or Scrum into your RFX ahead of time. Traditional vendors are going to struggle with this concept, and they're going to push back on you if you want to do fixed price. They're going to ask you for a time and material model, which can drain you dry. All right. So if you do have questions for me, you know, talk about that at the panel. And it's very essential to time your vendors appropriately when you're using Scrum or Agile, because in this particular example, we onboarded our QA vendor way too soon. Again, we're doing sprints, we're doing incremental functionality. We onboarded them where we would have on a traditional project, and then, you know, we ran out of money. We extended it a little bit, but then they were gone. You know, but then because we were using Agile, we could absorb the QA within our team, so we were okay. Ideally, I would have waited a little bit longer to onboard them. Documentation is lighter. My team is much more comfortable with this because it gives speed. It's a lot easier to work off of a mock-up, you know, maybe if you use iRise, you know, as a prototyping tool, or just a few slick sheets versus these large tomes. Again, you have to make sure your users, especially your business stakeholders, your users will be more comfortable with the small document because they can read it. No one wants to say, I heard this is your requirements, read 742 pages and let me know by tomorrow if we got it right. No one wants that, you know, because that actually is a very stressful thing to go through. If someone sends you something and says, this is what we heard you've been talking about for the past 6 months, now you verify that it's correct. We're working on intake right now. Are these the basics of what you need? skim it over, yeah, we're good. Here's the prototype, here's the demo, yeah, we're good. That gives you velocity. So documentation is lighter, and that is just so powerful. Change management, you have a lot more flexibility at the beginning of the project. Okay, because you can always say, here's our backlog, we're going to talk about it in sprint 3 or 5 or 6 or 7. Okay? When you get to the release of the final product, you can say, this is great, we're on release 1, so we've got all your core items that you need to function. Let's put these extra things that are coming now into a release 2, a release 3, and we'll just keep making the software better and better. Now I'm going to talk about this mid-size project, because this is different. This first one it's an in-house build, so I have staff aug contractors and I have vendors that come in to do QA or to do the ETL for the data migration piece. This affects about 11,000 end user childcare centers. It's really so fast, efficient, and accurate. That's the thing. It's accurate. So lessons are learned. So if you're going to go and you actually want to procure a vendor, who is well-versed in Agile, make sure you pick a product owner with operational and business process knowledge. Why? Because when you start, you need to map out your business process. And if you're going to be working just with someone who's maybe at a very senior stakeholder level as your product owner, that's not going to work. So this project, the licensing project, I'm actually working with one of our regional directors who works out in the field and actually knows what it means to license a location of care. If I was working with her boss, I would not have had this level of speed, because she in one session could just bang out, and first you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, here are the bottlenecks, and we're done. So that was really important, to pick your product owner appropriately. I highly recommend you pick a product owner who's going to use the software you're building. Okay, even from my perspective as a stakeholder, I often am, I have a very different perspective looking at software if I don't use it day in, day out. I have concepts and I have things that I think look good, but unless I'm actually using it, I won't know what the workflow should be. What we did is then we had her have a small team of subject matter experts that knew each type of licensed type of care. They reported into her. So I didn't have these large sessions with 100 people there, and I'm trying to listen to all these different ideas. Everything filtered through her so that we could have really good, meaningful sprints. And that was the speed of decision making that came. So our business requirements were incredibly light. They were just workflows. Are these the steps that happen? And then demos every single week. Was it worth it to go agile? What do you think? Absolutely, absolutely. It was really critical, both for the success of this really large project that has been challenged and suffered and failed multiple times over, and for mid-sized projects. The other thing I wanted to say is we've actually rolled out this methodology to our entire staff over at Early Education and Care. Sharon has done it across the Education Secretariat. So you can use it for operations, you can use it for infrastructure, you can use it for small projects. The key though is to evolve, train the staff on Agile, and evolve. Get that retrospective back from your staff as to what's working well. And just like I did when people were sitting down at the conference room and I walked in and I said, no, everyone's standing up and we're staying in the pen area, evolve it. Evolve it to what's going on in your organization. That's it. We don't need to go to the appendix slide, so thank you.
So what I wanted to talk about is some of the things that the Innovation Office is doing to support teams and some of the resources that are available. So right now we've got Scrum Master training. We're working with Jeff Sutherland, and I'm working with various agencies and teams to identify projects that we think there's value in having Go Agile. We're getting those teams trained and certified. We also have product owner training. And as you've heard from some of the speakers talking about their own project experience, this is extremely important, because you can have the development team cranking away knowing what Agile is and how it's all going to work, but if you don't have the other side of the equation on the same page, that's a real problem. So we definitely are encouraging product owner training, and I think at this point we've got a good cadre of people that are involved in that. The third piece that OGIO is sponsoring is coaching. You're going to have an opportunity to listen to Lars on the panel, but this has really proven to be the real linchpin in terms of success on projects. Getting this constant feedback, a neutral third party coming in and sharing experience and and in a very nice way, helping make course corrections. Very, very important piece of it. And then lastly, I've been walking around meeting with team leads and other people and trying to figure out, because we have a unique environment here. This is not, it's very interesting. One of the cool things about working so consistently over time with Jeff Sutherland is that he's learning about us and about the challenges that you all face delivering projects. And he's sort of softening his just tell them to change message. And some of that I think is real important in this environment. So we're looking at what are some of the ways that we can adopt the good things about it and then adapt to our specific environment. So just some stats. There's about 108 people who've been trained or are soon to be trained in the Scrum Master program. Definitely have opportunity to talk to some additional teams, and we're happy to do that. Make sure that we've got the right people lined up and that the projects are queued up for success. 25 people in the product owner training, and then we're deploying coaching across a set of projects. And one of the cool things about working with Lars has been his willingness to slice and dice. So some of the feedback that we've gotten is that some of the teams want a few hours to listen and learn, and then they want some time to themselves. So we've been able to schedule some of Lars' time to come in and deal with multiple teams during a week or a 2 weeks span. And then there's other teams where he's embedded full-time for a period of time. So we can be very flexible in that model and make it work for you. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the lessons learned and some of the reaction and pivot stuff that we're doing. We definitely see value in having the entire team trained. So the more people that understand the philosophy and are really buying into the benefits and buying into the fact that this is going to be change. And we all know change and innovation is uncomfortable sometimes. And if we get everybody on the same page, our degree of success is much more likely. Business sponsor training, really need to understand the time commitments. So Tom just talked about the traditional method where you write up the requirements document, send it over, they say yes, and then they feel like their part's done until all the building happens and then this beautiful package arrives and they react to it. That's not the case, as we've been talking. There's an expectation that those people are going to be actively involved, if not on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis, providing feedback, thinking about things, and identifying requirement changes in real time. And that's a big difference. So and we owe them the training and the explanation about how that's going to work. Leadership on board really has to come from the top. If you don't have executive buy-in, if you don't have somebody who's willing to step back and say, all right, I'm going to change the way I'm managing this whole group. I'm not going to call a meeting in the middle of your Scrum stand-up. I'm not going to pull people off of the project to run off on a fire drill. I'm going to give this a chance. Another thing that we've noticed, and Tom touched on this as well, sometimes we can do a restart on a project that's been struggling over a period of time. And I think some of it is just taking a fresh approach. Some of it is re-energizing the team, and in some cases re-energizing management to really look at it, because some of these projects are really mission critical. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the panel discussion. Show by doing. So as people adapt to the Agile approach, they start to apply it to all facets of running their business. So it's not just the stand-up for getting the development project done, it's we're going to run all of our meetings that way. Or as Brian was talking about, trying it to see about creating a document. So there's lots and lots of different business applications beyond just application development. And again, I'm really going to stress this whole notion of coaching. As Tom mentioned earlier, you study for the PMBOK and you forget half of it 20 minutes after the test is over. The coaching brings in that reinforcing message, and it also, the coach is able to identify behaviors where people are starting to crawl back into their comfort zone and really redirect them. And if we find that some of the training didn't take, we have a great training opportunity as well. And so the coaching really, really is a key part to making this work and getting through some of the blockers where people are going to just crawl back into their comfort zones. And a couple of points here. We have an internal wiki, and it is evolving on a daily basis, and there's lots of people contributing to it. That wiki contains some fairly detailed write-ups about Scrum, the concepts, the ceremonies, how they're applied. The syllabi for the various courses is in there. There's some photographs of some of the classes. There's some success stories and other material there. So if people are interested in learning more about Scrum, that's a great resource. And Scrum Inc., which is Jeff Sutherland's site, also has a lot of really great information just about how Scrum works and his philosophy of Scrum in general. All right, thank you.
I would like to ask the panelists to please come up to the stage and take your places. And as they're taking their places, I'm going to ask the audience a question. So how many of you here are actually directly involved in a project that's using Agile or Scrum? Please raise your hands. Well, it's maybe 25%, 30%. And so I assume, are the rest of you familiar and interested in Scrum or skeptics still? Are there any skeptics in the room? No, hopefully not after this discussion, right? So our goal is to move you over, into a place where you are starting to actively use Agile or Scrum in your organizations. I recently went with my PMO team to product owner training, and we're starting to use Scrum to do our own day-to-day operations and work. Some of you have seen we use the glass walls because we don't have a lot of wall space, so we use the glass windows to do our lists, and it's rather cool. So to start us off, I have some seed questions here, and the first one is for Brian. Brian, the question is, if a project manager wants to use Agile or Scrum methodology, where does he or she begin? And what are the basic building blocks that we need to set up a Scrum environment at the Commonwealth?
I would suggest that a project would need would be support. So the Scrum Master and the team needs to know that their project's important. If the Scrum Master is working on 8 projects and they're all important, there's a problem. Somebody, usually senior management, needs to make the decision that this is the most important and that this is the one we're going to go after and we're going to get it done, and then we're going to go on to the next one. And it sort of brings in a little focus into what's important for the organization, and it makes a project set up for success. In terms of the team itself, I think definitely training is key. Maybe not the whole team needs to be trained. It would be best if they could all be trained. It's a 2-day course. They come in, they get trained, they work together, they move together. The benefits of that is the next Scrum project, they don't need to be trained again. And that's sort of what we're finding now. You start with 1 project and then you're on to 8 projects. And it's the same teams that have been trained once and are just continually trying to improve. But that's how you get started, little training.
Tam, you have something to add to that since you talked about that topic?
Yeah, I think training is really key in getting buy-in from your team, because it depends on what type of culture and environment you're in. For us, there was definitely a culture change for those on my staff that have worked for the state for over 10, 15 years. So this was, well, what does this mean and how does this change things? It was uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable. But, honestly, in order to become effective and to be stronger, you do have to go through a phase of being uncomfortable. And the other side, and actually, I've had a few of you come and visit me over at Early Education and ask my staff, and they've all said, you know what, it did take some time to really understand what we were doing and how it would be beneficial, but they've all agreed, the communication is much, much better, and that lends itself right there to efficiencies.
So I think what we've seen is the answer is yes. Certainly in the e-licensing project, we have been very successful in making a transition. Now, one of the key success factors there was our partner, Accenture, was very willing to make the switch. They actually invested a lot of their own resources in training their people, in producing a coach so that our coach, Lars, has someone to talk to. And I think there are certainly contract and other kinds of issues that need to be worked through, and we're looking at all that in real time. So Linda Hamill and Pia and Tony Parham and Adolf and Tom Skinner and I met yesterday to kind of talk about what does that relationship look like, and how do payment terms and things like warranty come into play. So it is a different thing, but we definitely have seen success in that arena with e-licensing.
Sure. So I can speak to that because we ran into this problem a few years ago when I started, and it wasn't as well adopted at the Commonwealth to use Agile or Scrum. So what we did, the short answer is there's no standard template right now. Mass IT, and I'll turn it over to Rich in a minute, is, as he just mentioned, is in the process of really looking at this and what the mechanism would be. What I would advise you is it really depends on your project also, how large of a project it is and what you're actually RFQing. Make sure there's some language, in the front that speaks to Agile and Scrum. If you do get a response back from a vendor that is already up and running on Agile Scrum, you'll see that in their response. What you will get, again, in terms of negotiation with the vendor is a lot of them will want to work time and material. And we don't have a never-ending pool of money here at the Commonwealth. So you do really have to think about what approach, you use. Maybe you use a portion of it to be fixed price and use, some time and material, but really make sure you think about that depending on the scope of your project.
I think just one of the other things that we're struggling with is how do you define the milestones and then tie payments to those. And we talked yesterday about potentially tying it to the delivery of the stories. And then how do you align the stories to the sprints. So that's certainly one way. Warranty becomes another issue. The Commonwealth typically expects the vendors to provide a warranty. And if you've got all of these sort of interim deliverables, where does the integration test happen and how do you determine that? So we talked about things like holdbacks. We talked about if there's going to be multiple vendors, how do we assign responsibility back and forth? So I think there's some issues that need to be worked through. But to Tan's point, what we definitely are seeing is that the industry, the vendor partners, are very much on board with this, and they're also thinking about this. So we're not necessarily taking people from the Stone Age and trying to get them to catch up. They're there, and then we can meet in the middle.
You really need to get them up and running to start something. If you can't convince them to run the whole project, let's try to do some sprints at least. And maybe you have to start with time and material. It will probably be worth it. And then you can find a better business model later on. Yeah. Item to meetings like this, I suppose. I mean, they need to hear success stories, definitely. The one sentence that usually works is, you will get early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And valuable early, it usually works. You have to connect managers with managers that are already in the loop doing this. And sometimes I get invited to come and speak to managers just to explain what are we actually doing. So, networking.
Do you want to add to that, Brian, as to how you did it successfully at Egan?
You got to get them involved, right? You got to start. You got to invite them in. Invite them into some of the planning meetings. If you're doing. Show them the boards, show them your work boards, get them accounts, let them take a look, let them see what's going on. One thing in terms of status reports that we're tinkering with is the idea of using the product owner as the status voice. The product owner in our case is usually the business person. So if they are satisfied, they report up to their senior people that have the checkbooks if this is working, right? So it's no longer on the Scrum Master, it's no longer on the project manager to report status. Let it come from the voice of the business owner.
Sure, absolutely. So I've seen Scrum use Agile used effectively with an online system or with sticky notes. So I've walked into other organizations where they just have the to do, doing, and done. As long as you have those basic components, whether it's a whiteboard with sticky notes or just a wall with it, it's really going through that ceremony and making sure people understand that here are your backlog items, here's what we're working on right now in this sprint, and boom, here's done. You get that same satisfaction. There's a lot of satisfaction with moving something from doing to done. You know, and doing that at a stand-up, there's a lot of satisfaction, and there's a visual that goes with it. It goes back to what I said, make the work visual. So if you have a tool in your home office that you could use, like TFS, there's a few other tools that will have that same functionality. If not, don't let that be a stopping feature. Everybody has Post-it notes.
I'll start. So I think what we're seeing is a need to be very upfront in our requirements, that our expectation is that we will run in an agile way. And that would be done after we've given thought to the nature of the project and the resources that we'd be applying and what resources we need to buy. And if we feel very strongly that that's the approach we take, we put the bid out that way. Some of the vendors are not going to be able to respond to that, but others probably will, and we're seeing that the number that will is increasing over time. So I don't think it's necessarily a huge problem, but there's certainly the possibility that we would need to expand the universe of vendors moving ahead. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a matter of laying out conceptually what it needs to do, but also including as part of the process the creation of those user stories and getting the vendor involved in that. And in some cases, if it's a systems integrator or if we're talking about a COTS package, there's going to be domain expertise within the vendor, and it becomes more of a partnership.
I think you're right. You must dare to take the jump. You must take the risk. And usually you kick off with some kind of visioning workshops together with the vendor and the stakeholders, what the goal are with the project. And then you go further from that point. In small steps. Right. It's for me? Yeah. Usually when velocity flattens off, you are in some kind of technical debt. You have not doing your homework in automated testing, continuous integration, etc. Sooner or later, you can't just speed up the team more. You must also have a look at the technology you're using. And automated testing and continuous integration is definitely tools you need to use.
Brian, do you want to?
Sure. Yep. So I worked with Eric, which is excellent. So velocity dips on summer vacation. Velocity dips over Christmas or the holidays. Snowstorms. Right, these are a reality. We did chart our 9-month project, and clearly 4th of July, Thanksgiving. So those are dips. Those are, I would say, acceptable. But then somewhere along the project, it's the idea of adapting and changing, right? So you identify that something's not going well. Velocity isn't increasing. Maybe there's a slow downturn in velocity. One of the things that we did with our team to mix it up a little bit is that we brought in new people. I found that bringing in new people is invigorating. Everybody kind of comes to again. Sometimes they were trained in Scrum and sometimes not. So it was nice to get more people involved. A lot of times, you know, people in one of my projects weren't totally dedicated. They weren't 100% on the project, and we accepted that. We said, okay, that's okay. We're going to do it. We're going to see how it happens. And sometimes those people on the project got pulled into other things. But luckily, we brought in some new staff that was able to help out. And so once everybody started ramping up again, the velocity started to just shoot pretty much to the moon. So that's my experience with dips and tips.
Yeah, so I can speak to that because, again, for the first project I talked about, it's a fairly large project, and we had several different groups. You know, we had several different vendors working with us. We did find that it was very important at that high level to have that daily ceremony of a stand-up with all of the groups. What we did as the project evolved is, so if a particular vendor, let's say we had our data migration vendor, because that itself is a project. That itself is a project within the larger initiative. That team would then have their daily scrum specific to it. But we always set at the beginning of the day collaboratively as the large initiative team. So we had key people at that team call in, here are the key things we're doing in this sprint. And then for these other groups that were kind of, it's like a project within the initiative, they could then hold their own. But we wanted to make sure everyone was aligned and not siloed off, you know. And
Product owners? You mean the multiple product owners and Scrum Masters would attend?
yes, yes, yes. And in this case, we didn't have multiple product owners, but we did have multiple Scrum Masters. You could say that.
So Lars, is that what you call Scrum of Scrums?
Yes, right. And it's not always the Scrum Masters or the product owners. Sometimes you have a rotating role. Someone from the team is attending the Scrum of Scrums. And sometimes you need to add on a chief product owner. Depends on the size of the project. One success factor or two success factors to make these big projects work is one product backlog, not one for each team. Next suggestion would be, don't start with the big bang. Start with one team. We call it the tiger team. Let them do a couple of sprints. Then you split that team, like in 4 groups, and let them build new teams. Then you have the knowledge in each team, what has happened, you have the history, and they can start to evolve. Then you can split again if you want to. Depends on how big the project is.
So, I mean, in this case, again, we did start our project off with a core team because it takes time to go through procurement, and we onboarded these vendors. As soon as we onboarded a vendor for a particular sub-project piece of work, day one, they had to come to our stand-up and understand what our ceremonies were and they adjusted to it. I mean, that was really powerful to have them involved. And again, they may have then had separate meetings daily or weekly on their particular work streams, but as soon as you onboard them get them up to speed on how you're doing Scrum, what the ceremonies are, and what your current backlog is. You know, that also forces them or encourages them, that's a positive word, to align their work items in a similar way.
We have, good question.
Do you have a project manager on a Scrum project? That's like one question that I've heard come up
I am
before.
probably the most formally trained as a project manager. I'm also the Scrum Master. We've had product owners that are Scrum Masters that have been trained as Scrum Masters. It's, you know, the more knowledge, the merrier, as far as I can tell. You know, if you've been trained in traditional waterfall and PMI and things like that, that all adds value to a project. You throw Scrum on top of that, that's more value to a project. And you give it a strong methodology, you know, which is a basic roadmap that can be followed, sprints, stand-ups, retrospectives, things like that. It's all valuable.
I think the first thing you need to unlearn, I'm also a project manager, is that you don't tell people what to do. That's up to the team to decide what to do. And most companies keep a project management control structure above the agile teams. I think it's mostly greenfield companies that started around one product that are purely agile and have no project managers. But if you have project managers, Scrum Masters, product owners in the same team, you really need to define the roles. That's where you get conflicts. And usually it's about muscle memory from the project managers, and they start to interfere. I think that's context sensitive. It really depends on what company you're in, how much of the company is transformed by now, etc. You will start to see good things immediately, and you will remove the last impediments years from now. Yeah.
Yeah, and one other way that we've implemented Scrum is we started it by the book, right? So the idea is that a few people get trained and just start exactly how you've been trained. You know, there's roles, like you said, Scrum Masters, product owners. There's no project managers in there. they're a team member, stick with the book, run it a few sprints, evaluate if it's working. If it's not working, figure it out. Maybe you need another role. But definitely the easiest way to start is buy the book, get trained, run it, and adjust.
I'm going to speak to that and kind of quantify it because I think people will be interested to hear what the adoption time was. I had two basic differences in my groups. I had one group of people that had been working in the traditional way for, let's say, 15 years plus. And I had another group that came in and were newer to the organization. Okay. For the group that was newer, I would say probably about 2 months to really adapt to the concept of Scrum and be really efficiently running. Okay. That gave us a few sprints. For the group that had been working in a very traditional methodology for 15 years plus, I'm actually going to ask you, do you think it took them longer or shorter to adapt? Yep. So that was probably about 6 months of really just working with them every single sprint until we started seeing the benefits. It did take longer, and there were lots of questions. There were lots of questions as to, even though we educated and we trained, well, we're doing this because Tan said to. Okay, so that was the first reaction, all right? Because Tan said to. We don't understand why we're doing it. So then we educated again, and then we asked them, what do you like about this? And the first thing that they said was the communication. It eliminated the need for 10 separate meetings, on all of these projects or on a project. And instead, we just had the stand up and the communication started going faster. And really helping them understand the concept of self-managing within the team. And this whole, I love the concept of unlearning, because even I have had to unlearn a lot. I went through the process of being PMP trained and everything, so I've had to unlearn a lot of that and not let it affect my ego. It's okay, I learned all of that, that's all right. But I had to unlearn it, and the roles within my team were a lot more careful in terms of what we call a particular person. Okay, because it really goes back to the backlog. What are we doing in each particular sprint, and who's attacking those items? Instead of just defining someone as a BA or a developer or a report developer, whatever the functions are that you have, helping them to ease into the backlog items. These are the things that we're tackling together as a team, and asking that question every sprint: what are we all doing to help get this work done as a team for this particular sprint? So different language. It's a big culture change. It's a big culture change, but by doing it's a lot of fun though too. So once they start going to it for a few times, like the first few times with my staff that had been there for a long time, there was just like everyone came and stood in a room. Then they looked at each other. They didn't know what to say. They thought it was just like a normal status. It took them a little while to, okay, this is what we're doing in the sprint. These are the backlogged items. Talk about what you did yesterday and today related to the particular backlogged item that you were tackling. And really also the other thing that evolved over time was by doing it and tracking the time, the velocity. People, without feeling threatened, people naturally realized that they were way underestimating the amount of time a particular item took to get completed. Traditional methods, you block a certain amount of time to do an activity. What happens by the time you get to the end of that time? Well, you need a little bit more time. You got a little bit of slip, and then a little bit of slip, a little bit of... Doing it this way helps make that visible without making people feel like they are being punished because it took them the correct amount of time to do the work. So that is actually an excellent question, okay? Because, again, this is transformation now. Agile in a government setting, I firmly believe, is different, okay? We've come a long way. I'm so excited to see so many people here and that you're interested in actually embracing this. So let me talk about the licensing project. So we're going to have multiple releases, but I'm also the technical team has really evolved, so we're very excited about that. But my end user population for these applications is not my IT team. Okay, so in my licensing, I have 2 releases. The first one's going to be in April. That's exciting. Question, true or false? Are the end users going to start using it in April? Maybe, kind of. Okay, so we're going to release it to them, and we're going to actually give them a month or 2 to adapt to it before they're actually putting real-time data into the application. Okay, so we're going to give them some, because it's been so incredibly fast and efficient, it's almost a little bit like wow in your face for them. Release 2 gives them the full suite of functionality. They're not entirely ready, and I didn't push them on this, to start using software in this kind of modular approach, because ideally I would love to see them using Release 1, knowing that Release 2 is coming up in June, and by the time we have Release 2, they're already fully trained, they're in the software, then Release 2 comes and they're fully functional. But we're again dealing with a population that for them it's the first time going through this. So we kind of came up with a mitigation plan. Release 1, start using it. I'll do another data refresh in June when they can use the full this full suite of functionality. But that's how I'm addressing it there. Once they're in it and they're using it, I think they'll be a lot more amenable to, and now this is coming, and now this is coming. But the first time round, you do have to be a little bit flexible yourself in terms of how your end users are going to adapt to it. I can talk briefly about that. And again, it doesn't matter if you have a tool to use or not. I run into this all the time. I have multiple projects that are running. We're using this methodology. And yes, I have one resource that's split across multiple projects, okay? So what we've done in that particular situation, any sprint that you have a number of working days, you have a number of hours that you're going to be dedicating. Make sure you're very upfront with each project and with each Scrum Master that there's only this many hours dedicated to this particular sprint, and then be realistic in terms of how many backlog items can be done with that number of hours. So let's say your sprint is 1 week long, this person gets 2 hours a day to work on it. What's that math? It's 10 hours, for the week. Don't assign them, so many backlog items that's 40 hours worth of work. Really give them that flexibility so that it's a reasonable expectation. Also putting it all up in one place so they can see it. They can actually adjust their own time. Not everybody works well with, all right, 2 hours a day, I'm going to work on this project. This is another evolution, especially for my legacy team. They really resisted it, and I had to listen to their feedback. 2 hours a day on this project, 2 hours a day on project 2, 2 hours. No, that didn't really work, but you lay it all out, and this is what they came back to me. Tan, Monday, Tuesday, bam, I'm going to bang out this, and then I know that project's done, and everyone else can work on it. And then the other days I'm going to do this, and I'm done. That worked more effectively for them. Listen to the feedback from the people who are actually doing the work and give them that flexibility to adjust.
As you, as you say, context shifting is a real pain. You don't want it, you really don't want it. And you should do it like Tan did. Ask the team, how do you want to do it? Right. And they did it one task for a couple of days, etc. And that's, well, you must try something and get down to the team, let the team decide how they want to solve stuff. You will always have certain persons that are going around to different teams. They have their skill of a legacy system or whatever, and probably a lot of managers will be involved with requirements as well. One way is to set up a backlog for these persons. We call them travelers. They go from team to team.
Can everyone hear that? Yeah. So travelers set up backlogs for those travelers.
And the managers must meet and do the prioritization of the backlog. Where's the most important thing this week? Okay, that team. So support that team.